So our application is working, and it's producing for us animated GIFs, which are providing a lot of joy in my life. And particularly, it's added this upgraded slide with our animated image of our Ruby being placed inside of a container, right? So one thing though is that we're using the scaffolding to generate our application, and that means that we're allowing the scaffolding to take care of a lot of things, and raises the question, how do I actually configure my application? Like, how does the application default to run on port 8000? And how could I change that default to run on port 9000? And that's what we're going to explore in this exercise. So we're going to look at setting the configuration in two different ways over this next few minutes. The first way is we're going to find a way to repackage our application with our new configuration. So we're going to find the defaults that ship with it, update them, and then repackage and then redeploy. The other way we're going to do it is to actually do an in-place update. So we might have a service running and we just want to give it a new configuration without repackaging and redeploying. This is going to be an easy and fun way of doing it with our Habitat Supervisors. So let's get started. So like I said before, we used the scaffolding to generate our app for us, and it took care of a lot of things. Remember, if I look at the actual Habitat directory within the project folder, I see that the plan file contains a few lines and really not much. I specified one runtime dependency on my image magic library, and I specified a package version. It generated for me a defaults TOML file, which tells me this is where I can define my configuration values, but nothing's inside of there. So the scaffolding took care of other runtime dependencies, lifecycle hooks, configuration files that need to be loaded, and what I'm calling the config values version 0, the defaults that get shipped with it. What we'd like to do is actually copy those values out and then modify them. So I'm going to take a look at our studio in one of the packages that I recently built. So here in the studio, I ran the build command to essentially package our application. What it did do is install our application. So after the build completed, we've got a package here that's installed. I'm going to look at the contents of this directory, and you're going to see there are a number of directories and files here that describe how the package is managed or created. And so here I'm going to look at the contents of the default.toml file. So we see here the default.toml file contains those defaults or configuration values version 0 that the scaffolding determined for us based on how it determines things should run. All right, so these are the values that we want to augment, right? In this case, the app port value we want to set to 9000. So I'm going to copy the contents of this file into my Habitat directory. Right, and I'm going to look at this in my editor. Remember, my studio has mapped this directory into my essentially directory where my editor is. And you'll see that my default TOML file has now been updated. So let's make a change to this to set this to port 9000 and then run build. So this is going to repackage our application, and it's going to use our new port value. Right. But let's take a look at our documentation, at least the documentation, the scaffolding one that's found in the GitHub project under core plans. So underneath the scaffolding Ruby directory, there is a doc directory, and inside of there is a reference.markdown file. And inside of there is some pretty useful information, particularly related to the default app environment variables that are currently set up. It's going to show you that same language value or the port value that we essentially saw in the defaults that we created. You can also see there's a way to specify new environment variables if you need to within your plan file. So this is a great reference material that you can use to update or modify your scaffolding if things aren't working for you right out of the box. Okay, so it looks like our package is complete. So let's return to the package over here. I'm going to do a quick view of the contents of that defaults TOML file that now is in our newest package, and I'll see that, yep, there we are. We have our app port 9000. So let's actually see this run. So I'm going to do a hab sup start, and I'm going to run our package that's contained inside of here. So this should be our directory. I want to make sure that I run the latest one, so I'm going to run 716 versus 152. This should start up. I'll run sublog, and sublog is going to tell me, hey, it's running. And there I see, there it is on port 9000. So things are working. But let's curl it just to make sure to kind of see the site is up and running. So curl is not installed inside of the studio, so I'm going to run habpackage install core curl, and then I'm going to use the -b flag to bin link the curl command. The curl command is now available to me, and I'll curl localhost 9000. So there's our form that allows us to provide images. So everything is working for us. So I'm going to run hab sup stop and stop our application. And then I'm going to do a hab sup status to check on the status of the supervisor to make sure that the service has been unloaded. All right, so to review quickly, what we found was that the scaffolding did a lot for us. It gave us our configuration values version 0. What we've done now is brought that into our application. So we're bringing our application and some default values, in this case for our port that we're overriding. So we are still relying on the scaffolding for a lot, but this is a great way for us to modify the scaffolding in a way that changes the values that we need it to be. Okay, so let's look at our second approach, which our second approach involves us understanding a little bit more about Habitat supervisors and how they communicate with one another, and how they essentially create groups within there to sort of set configuration correctly. Okay, so here we are going to run, like we did in the studio, our application. And that launches our application under a supervisor, and that supervisor is going to, of course, use whatever configuration is in the package at the moment. Right? We repackaged it, but if we're using the old one, say the previous version, of course, we would possibly need to upgrade it. Okay. When you add other applications to the supervisor ring, essentially you define peers. And peers mean that you need to specify one other supervisor that's running in the supervisor ring that you want to join. So in this case, if this one joined, you would point to this supervisor. If you wanted this supervisor to join the same ring, you'd point it to this supervisor or this one when it joined. As long as you point it to one of them, it doesn't matter who brought it into there. They essentially form the ring. Now it's important because, of course, if one of these were to leave, all the remaining members are still connected within the ring. They're not going to disconnect from one another. So that's how they form their mesh network that they have there. And that's important because we want to know how to actually send configuration into the system. We need to know about how supervisors gossip with one another. Because what happens is when we send configuration updates, the supervisors in the entire ring will gossip with one another and send these updates around. Now, the other thing that supervisors do is they generate service groups for our applications. And they separate our service groups essentially by application. First and foremost. So you see here I've created, it automatically is created by the Habitat Supervisor, a Habitiat-ize.default service group. And then a secondary service group here for our other application automatically goes into other app.default. Now, .default is not based on anything. That's essentially if you don't provide a group name. You can provide a group name, and it's useful to use group names like production or stable, unstable type of things that you might use to describe what these applications in this group are performing. So in this case, if we were to have two separate groups, like this one might be our unstable environment, this might be our stable environment, or default and production, we can now send configuration to any supervisor in the ring to tell them which group to upgrade. Right? That's useful to test out our configuration upgrades. So here we can use the habconfig apply command. We can target any peer within our network, so it could be this one. It's most likely going to be this one, but it can be any of them as long as they're in the network or in the ring. We then specify the service group that we're interested in. In this case, we're interested in the Habitiat-ize default service group. And then we give it a version number. So that's that version number that we're seeing upgraded here. So the version values that we want. And then we need to provide a file which contains our default TOML content. So we might say, hey, why not this file, right? Our updated configuration. Right? Now, what's nice about our sort of example here is that we didn't target our production one. We can test out our configuration upgrade inside of this safe environment, and when we feel comfortable, we can send that now to our Habitiat-ize.prod service group and essentially see the same upgrade benefits once we've proved that it's worked. All right, so let's actually play with that inside of the studio itself. So remember, I've got a previous version of the application built here, the one that contains the port 8000. So what I'm going to do is do a hab sup start, and I'm going to use this as my starting point. All right, so I'm going to tail the logs using sup log, or the abbreviated SL. Here we'll see that our application is now running at port 8000, which is great. So that's our older version. What we want to do is a configuration upgrade to this machine. So I'm going to use a hab config apply, right? And let me move this down here just so you can get an idea of this. Hab config apply, we're going to specify a peer. There's only one supervisor, and that's running inside the studio, so I'll use localhost. I'm going to specify the service group. In this case, Habitiat-ize is the app. I didn't specify a service group when I launched it, so I'm going to use the default group. I'm going to specify version 1. I can specify any incrementing value that I want. And then I'm going to use the habitat directory / default.toml file. Press enter, and I'm going to send this configuration out to our machine. So here now I can tail the logs again. We'll see that our application has now officially restarted and it's running on port 9000, but what's probably better is to take a look at is our curl command. So let's see, curl localhost 9000, and we'll see that our site is now upgraded. Now, there's one other way that we can use the hab config apply command, and that's actually piping data in. So instead of reading from a file while in the studio, we would probably be interested in just kind of sending a quick update. So here I'm using echo command, and I'm going to create some TOML. So in this case, I need to create a TOML file that represents the port change that we want. So in this case, let's set this to port 10,000, and I'm going to pipe the results of this to a hab config apply. Now, what's interesting about this hab config apply that we're going to use here is that I'm not going to use a peer flag. When you're localhost, you don't actually need to specify it. So while you're in the studio or you're on a system where the Habitat Supervisor is running, you don't need to use the peer flag. So in this case, we are local, so we don't need to use it. So I need to say, let's use Habitiat-ize.default, so the service group. I then will need to specify a version number, not 1, because I already used that, so let's use 2. And then I don't need to provide a file because I'm echoing in this content right here, which is going to replace my existing configuration. So I'm going to see that the configuration should be applied correctly, and I can do a sup log again to see if everything looks good. And you'll notice again, right here, port 10,000 is now running. Now, of course, I want to check this with the localhost curl to 10,000. Sweet, there's our site, right? And there's now nothing running on 9,000 and definitely nothing running on 8,000. So we did an in-place configuration upgrade using the hab config apply command. Okay, so like I said, I showed you 2 ways you can manage your configuration. First, we repackaged with the configuration. So we took the default generated from the scaffolding, we copied it into our package, source code, and then we modified it to have the values that we wanted. Then we rebuilt the application, of course redeployed it in any way that we wanted it. But we also saw the other way, which is we can take existing packages that are already deployed, already running underneath the supervisor, and send them configuration updates. Remember, we can target a peer, localhost, as long as we target any peer within the supervisor network. We need to give it a service group, right? And we want those service groups because we might want an unstable or stable, development or production environments. And then we can use a file, or we can use a pipe value from the command line. Now, to be honest, I think this is fun and useful within like test environments while you're doing your dev, that kind of stuff. For most part, you want to use this one. This one is where you're going to be able to store your configuration, right? You want to be able to check that into version control. And so this is probably the better approach if you're going to be managing your supervisors with Habitat and the configuration upgrades. All right, thank you very much. I'll see you next time.